Hello, everyone, and welcome to Till All of Us Are Free, Convergences of Reproductive Justice and Prison Abolition, hosted by the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. I'm Sarah Clark Kaplan, the Executive Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, and welcome to the event. ARPC is a hub and incubator for intersectional, transnational, and interdisciplinary research and action. For those of us who are unfamiliar with us, we bring together scholars, grassroots organizers, community partners, cultural producers, and policy advocates in equitable, reciprocal, and sustainable collaborations to share knowledge and build movements. We approach our work from the belief that knowledge is co-created, that lasting structural change requires profound cultural shifts, and that academic partnerships for justice must root locally to grow global change. From working groups to research initiatives to toolkits to public convenings, ARPC convenes academic researchers with community-based change makers around 4 key research and impact areas: race and carcerality, reproductive justice, educational equity and justice, and climate, land, and environmental justice. Now, since we're grounded in the tenets and methods of feminist of color and indigenous feminism, ARPC approaches these areas not as separate, but as specific. That is, as deeply entangled in their logics, origins, causes, and effects. And we recognize that some of the most generative sites for engagement and intervention are at those points of relation, convergence, and connection. Tonight's panel represents just such a convergence point, or in fact, several of them. Not only are we bringing together the work of our affiliates and fellows in the areas of carceral politics and in reproductive justice, we're also connecting our 22-23 programming theme, Race and Reproductive Politics After Roe, with our 2023 to 2024 programming theme, Abolition Everywhere. Moreover, today's panelists are all scholar activists whose work at the intersections of 2 liberatory traditions, reproductive justice and prison abolition, produce knowledge and material change, both inside and outside of the university, inside and outside of carceral systems, inside and outside of the territorial boundaries of the United States. Tonight's conversation is among 3 remarkable feminist of color thinkers and activists working at the intersections of reproductive justice, gender justice, and abolition. And I want to say that I think that's always how every panel starts. We never invite people who we don't think are amazing, but I will say that this panel does have a special place in my heart. These 3 remarkable scholars are people who 2 of them are people who I've been organizing with for my own life and who taught me my whole adult life and who taught me a great deal of my own approaches to thinking about reproductive justice, prison abolition, and the abolishing of gender-based violence. And also we're lucky enough to have scholars who are doing new and cutting edge work who are trained by some of the very people who we all worked with. So this feels like an incredible opportunity. That's also a bit of a homecoming for me. So I'm so grateful that they're here. Our 3 panelists are Dr. Priya Kandaswamy, Associate Professor of Women's Studies at San Diego State University, Dr. Connie Won, Executive Director and co-founder of AAPI Women Lead, and Dr. Cynthia Martinez, UC Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow in Latin American and Latino Studies at UC Santa Cruz. And I'll be doing longer introductions of each panelist with their full bios right before they speak. But I wanted to give you a better sense of what we're going to be doing for the next hour or so. In advance of this panel, we asked each of our speakers to frame their remarks through the following 3 questions. What lessons and opportunities emerge from a conjoined critique of the carceral logics of policing and imprisonment and the containment, criminalization, and surveillance of sexuality and reproduction? Second, what are the potential implications of an abolitionist reproductive freedom movement that centers the work of Indigenous, Black, and other feminists of color on anti-violence, decriminalization, and decarceration? And third, how could we articulate a collective vision of racial and immigrant justice mobilization that is grounded in intersectional and anti-carceral futurities? Each of our speakers will be taking a few moments, about 8 to 10 minutes, I think I told them, to speak their own thoughts and how this connects to their own thinking, their own practice, their own work. And then I'll ask a few questions, putting them in conversation with each other. And then finally, we'll open to the group. Would you like those questions to be entered into the chat so you can read them? That's a great idea. Absolutely. I will do that as soon as we move on from me talking. After we open to the group, we'll open to the group after the questions. And then just a few notes for those of you who would benefit. I want to make sure you know that captions are available. For those of you who process better when you have a chance to watch something again, a recording of this will be available and up on our website and our YouTube channel. Not immediately after the event, but soon. That's usually how. And if you have questions or indeed concerns, as our guest Laura Carter did, you can always use the Q&A if you're having problems with technology or you need other forms of assistance to participate fully. With that said, with no further ado, I am going to open the event and I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Priya Kandaswamy. Dr. Priya Kandaswamy's research and teaching explore how race, gender, and sexuality and class have shaped ideas of national belonging and practices of state violence in the United States. An associate professor of women's studies at San Diego State University, she's the author of Domestic Contradictions, Race and Gendered Citizenship from Reconstruction to Welfare Reform, which came out of Duke University Press in 2021. And documents how constructions of gendered citizenship articulated to curtail Black freedom during the Reconstruction era continue to haunt more contemporary debates about public assistance and economic inequality in the United States. Bringing together insights from queer studies, feminist studies, and ethnic studies, her work is engaged with and deeply indebted to the historical and contemporary movements for welfare rights, domestic workers' rights, reproductive justice, prison abolition, and liberatory education. Prior to joining the faculty at San Diego State, she was a professor and chair of women's gender and sexuality studies at Mills College, and the academic program director at Mount Tamalpais College, a community college that serves incarcerated students at San Quentin State Prison. And I'll turn over now to Dr. Priya Kandaswamy.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Sarah, and thank you to everyone involved in organizing this panel. I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation with such amazing people whose work I really admire and many of whom I have a very long relationship with. So this is like very special and I'm very excited to be able to participate. In the time I have, I really want to just raise a few kind of more big picture questions or points that I think emerge when we think abolition and reproductive justice together. I'll draw on some examples from my own work as well as some examples from the world more generally. But in raising these questions, my intention is really to highlight some of the problems or tensions that I think it would be useful for us to try and think through in this particular political moment. So I don't know that I'm necessarily going to offer something terribly new, but I wanted to try to give to offer something that I think is important for us to think about or useful in this particular moment. So first, as we grapple with the proliferation of state-level abortion bans, along with right-wing attacks on queer and trans people in this particular contemporary moment, how do we refuse a distinction between innocent subjects who are unjustly targeted by what are often conceptualized as irrational or excessive laws and supposedly guilty subjects who we think of as deserving to be in prison? Why is refusing that distinction between those who are innocent and those who are guilty, or those who, or criminalization that is irrational and criminalization that is seen as rational or self-evident, important? And what possibilities might it open up for approaches that challenge both liberal reformism and right-wing extremism? So in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, I think we see, right, a proliferation of stories about women and reproductive healthcare providers who are being unjustly criminalized for seeking or providing abortions. And often I think we are currently sort of presented with the image of a woman who is imprisoned for having an abortion as a sign of the dangers of a patriarchal and fascist state. I think, right, for example, as someone speaking from California amongst people who imagine themselves as liberals, right, that criminalization is frequently cast as irrational, as religious extremism of some form, and as different from other forms of criminalization that those of us who do abolitionist work around the prison industrial complex are often trying to contest. I think making this distinction is dangerous for a number of reasons. First, when some forms of criminalization are deemed as irrational or sort of particularly unjust, other forms of criminalization, particularly the criminalization of violent crimes, are implicitly deemed rational. While seeking and providing abortion, for example, is certainly not murder. I think a lot of times the way we make these arguments reinforces the idea that the way that we treat people who we do see or decide are murderers is just. And so really actually trying to think about how could we intervene in or interrupt the tendency to make that distinction discursively. Second, I think making this distinction, and I think this is actually really important, fundamentally misunderstands the work of criminalization. Right? Criminalization functions to individualize and thereby make invisible structural problems and contain structural forms of change. So one of the things that reproductive justice teaches us is to move away from individual choice as a framework, or to focus sort of on individual action, and to instead think about the larger context surrounding the individual. I think this insight is useful in thinking about all forms of criminalization, not just reproductive decision-making. Third, in thinking about the criminalization of reproductive choices, gender expression, various forms of sexuality, I think it's vital that we engage with the ways that the state infrastructure of criminalization has been built through anti-Blackness and settler colonialism. In a lot of my work, I like to think about or sort of try to articulate the ways that there's a real specificity to anti-Blackness in how the prison industrial complex has been constructed, and in how various technologies of domination and state violence operate, right? That it's important to note the way that those specific technologies often have very expansive effects. So for example, like one example I might offer is prior to the Dobbs decision, one of the first cases of a woman being incarcerated for self-inducing an abortion was the case of Priya Patel, who was convicted of feticide in the state of Indiana. A number of activists really took up her case and mobilized for her release successfully, but which is really important. And also, though, I think like moments like that offer us kind of useful ways of thinking about how is actually the criminalization of feticide or abortion connected to a long-standing practices, right, of criminalizing pregnancy amongst Black women. So particularly we might think about the infrastructure for criminalizing substance using women who were often deemed as crack mothers, right, during the 1990s, as paving the pathway then for the criminalization of other kinds of pregnancy or other forms of reproductive decision-making. So I think that when we can engage with that larger infrastructure, rather than pointing to particular examples that get deemed as exceptional, we're more positioned to make meaningful, right, interruptions into or sort of contributions, right, to abolitionist politics. Kind of building on that, I think that, right, like it's important for us to consider the ways that we, right, frame conversations around the criminalization of abortion in terms that often lead to kind of an exceptionalist politics, right? To say that there's something really exceptional about certain forms of criminalization, and instead really try to think about how can we think about more expansive ways of connecting, right, the criminalization of abortion, for example, to criminalization writ large. I think a really good example of this actually is in the state of California. The California Coalition for Women Prisoners has been a really active participant in a campaign to drive life without parole sentencing. And one of the things that I think is really like wonderful and beautiful about this campaign is that it emerges, right, from the recognition that women who are survivors of domestic violence are often given life without parole sentences for things that they do in self-defense, and that this leads, right, organizers to move towards abolishing the life without parole sentence in its entirety, rather than trying to carve out an exceptional space in which we might say, oh, well, because someone is a victim of violence, they don't deserve that kind of sentencing, but other people do, right? So I think that's a really good example of how we might make expansive choices, right, rather than choices that are grounded in exceptionalism. The second question I wanted to raise is, in thinking about reproductive justice and abolition, how do we understand the state and its relationship to the regulation of reproduction and the family? In some of my other work, I argue that state power and the heteropatriarchal family should be seen as co-constitutive entities. So the heteropatriarchal family produces and naturalizes hierarchy, it produces and naturalizes settlement, and it also introduces a division between public and private space that often functions to legitimize different forms of state power. In turn, state policy actively produces the heteropatriarchal family as something that is seemingly natural, right? So there's this kind of reciprocal relationship there. I also think the family has operated within social welfare policy as a vehicle for racial stratification. So you can sort of look historically and see the ways in which, for white people, claims rooted in the family have offered them entitlements, rights, privacy, whereas in relation to Black people, the family has been a site of obligation, surveillance, and the privatization of responsibility. I think contemporary assaults on reproductive rights, non-reproductive sexualities, and challenges to the binary have their roots, right, in a crisis of the heteropatriarchal family that is also necessarily a crisis of the state. Whereas I think liberal reformism often seeks to reinvent a more inclusive family, and we can think about all of the different ways that like political groups have made claims rooted in family. I think it's important for us to think about how we can actually engage with this crisis and recognize that horizontal forms of power might be a necessary and important threat to the state in this moment, right? And particularly, I think it's important to think critically about the state as not like, as maybe something that we engage sometimes as a tool, but not as the site at which change happens or as the final goal of organizing, right? Like, how do we strategically engage with the state, but actually think about forms of transformation that are not about, right, state recognition, inclusion, and rights. And just to sort of offer a couple examples here, like I think, for example, Jules Gill-Peterson's work documenting the history of DIY transition and trans communities is a really interesting way of thinking about how like horizontal relationships between people, information sharing, recognition of knowledge, and sharing medical technology within communities could be an interesting way of actually formulating forms of power that aren't grounded in seeking something from the state, actually carving things out that support community-based forms of control. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of ask or sort of point to the ways that organizing against prisons ought to be more central in reproductive justice movements. And I think there's been a lot of really wonderful organizing that thinks about reproductive justice in prison, right? So for example, people have done amazing work to highlight coercive sterilization in California prisons, or to think about, right, like practices of shackling during birth and right to curb those things. But I also want to point to the ways that prison itself is foundationally a violation of reproductive justice. And we can think about how, right, prisons violate bodily autonomy, how everyone who is incarcerated is someone's child who has been taken from them, how many people inside are parents who are also struggling to keep their relationships with their children while they're incarcerated, and how prisons create barriers and incredibly challenging circumstances in which people from communities on the outside do reproductive labor to support their people inside, as well as people on the inside do reproductive labor to support each other and to support people on the outside. Similarly, communities targeted by carceral institutions are often the same communities that experience environmental racism, lack of access to the things that you need to be healthy, right? High stress, violence, economic marginalization, and a host of other challenges. So I think that engaging all of these issues together, right, and thinking about how they intersect and interact is an important kind of point of intervention for us. I'm going to stop there and pass it along.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kandaswamy. That was amazing and gives us a great deal to start our conversation with at the end. I'm going to introduce now our second panelist, Dr. Cynthia Martinez, UC Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the Latin American and Latino Studies Department at UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Cynthia Martinez is a first-generation Chicana scholar and community organizer focusing on migrant detention, state sexual violence, and feminist abolition theory and praxis. She earned her PhD in ethnic studies from the University of California, Riverside, and in 2022, and is currently a UC postdoctoral fellow and incoming assistant professor, oh, that's great news, at UC Santa Cruz. Part of her community organizing work includes her role as a deportation defense volunteer supporting queer migrants in ICE detention in Adelanto, California. Cynthia's research focuses on sexual violence and reproductive injustice in ICE detention facilities, while examining how affected communities and migrant activists more broadly are forging geographies of abolition by confronting the connections between carceral and border regimes. And in this moment, I want to also just give a quick shout out to Dr. Martinez's work on a forthcoming film in collaboration. She's the co-writer and co-producer with Dr. Setsu Shigematsu and Mayan Denton of a forthcoming film tentatively titled Ghosts of Adelanto, The Rise of Abolish ICE. So be on the lookout for that. And with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cynthia Martinez.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I am going to share my screen. I have, oh, is it disabled? Sorry. Well, I was going to share my screen, but that's fine. I could just go ahead and talk a little bit about my work. So thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Cynthia Martinez. I am currently a postdoctoral fellow at UC Santa Cruz, and I am transitioning to an assistant professor faculty in the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies in the fall at UC Santa Cruz. My research specifically lies within the intersection of migrant detention, state-gendered violence, and reproductive justice or injustice, and abolition thought. And a little bit about me is where I want to begin with this work. Oh, I think I could screen share. I just love pictures. Images are great. Okay, so here we go. So let me do the presentation mode. There you go. Okay, so we're good. A little bit about me. I am the only US citizen in my family, and I grew up in Mexico. Actually, I'm having this call from Mexico. I've been involved myself in migrant justice and organizing since I was in high school due to my family's undocumented status. So my entire family is undocumented, but I do hold a lot of privilege being the only US citizen in my family. And a little bit about me to expand on this is that at the time that I was actually a PhD student, I was volunteering and I was an activist organizing in deportation defense with the Immigrant Youth Coalition in Los Angeles. And I was part of the Free the People campaign. And later I joined the Adelanto Visitation Network. And from there, I began visiting people who are detained in the Adelanto ICE Detention Center, which is a detention center that's located in a desert, like in a rural desert town in California in San Bernardino County. And through that work, I began visiting people and primarily women and queer migrants. And I was supporting them through their case, supporting them, right, as the leaders in their own struggle to attain their liberation. And I did this through not only just providing that emotional support and bearing witness to the violence they were experiencing, but I also was connecting them to resources, legal resources, as well as funding campaigns for their bonds for them to attain their liberation. So through that work, I was, a witness to a lot of the horrors that occur in ICE detention. And just quickly, this is here we have this poster that says Abolish ICE, which I want to mention that I have been part of the migrant justice movement for a long time, since I was in high school. So I've seen the different shifts in migrant detention, migrant justice, from immigrant rights movement to the migrant justice movement. And now, we're having a lot of conversation around Abolish ICE, which I do talk about and sometimes critique. So this picture is a part of protest. It's part of a protest that they had. Organizers in Adelanto took some coffins from the detention center. Oh my goodness, from the detention center, and took the coffins to the city hall in the Adelanto city of chambers. And they put these coffins of migrants who had passed away in the detention center, just laid out in the city hall for the city leaders to recognize the violence. Okay, so then just going forward with the work that I've done academically, it's in conjunction with my activist organizing work as well. So my current book project is entitled Ice on Fire: Incinerating Prison Border Violence Through Abolition Feminism. And through that work, I look at different forms of gender sexual violence. I'll skip that one. I look at different forms of gender and sexual violence that occur in ICE detention. And that's something that I want to highlight specifically for this panel, that when I'm talking about or referring to sexual gendered violence or sexual terror inside ICE detention, what I have focused on is these primarily points or forms of violence. The first is the rampant cases of sexual assault and rape in ICE detention. So I have this chart here that I gathered or put together. And this chart shows the top 6 agencies within the DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And as we see here, you could see that ICE holds the highest amount of allegations of assault and rape that occur within the facility, followed by CPB, which is the Customs Border Enforcement or Patrol. So one of the main things that I argue in my work is that the reason why ICE, the agency of ICE, has one of the highest cases or has the highest cases of sexual assault occurring within the whole Department of Homeland Security is that ICE is both a prison and a form of bordering, right? So the type of violence that is observed and enacted in ICE detention is not just a gendered and reproductive violence that can be traced to border violence, but it's also a type of violence that we see often happening in prisons. And therefore, ICE detention is the site of coalition, quite literally where prisons and borders collide. So another form of sexual terror that I look at in my work is the coerced hysterectomies in ICE detention. And, a lot of folks have heard about the series of allegations and whistleblowers that have come out to talk about the coerced hysterectomies that were done to women in the Georgia's Irwin Detention Center. One of the things that I highlight in that is that one of the erasures that happened with that breaking news is that it was mostly Black women, Black African women who were subjected to these hysterectomies, right? So there's these layers and intersections of violence as well within ICE detention, where a lot of folks didn't even hear that it was African Black migrants who were the primarily targets of this type of violence. And finally, another form of reproductive and sexual violence in ICE detention that I look at is very specific to Adelanto. And here I wrote Adelanto's toxic dowsing. So what has been going on and has occurred mostly in Adelanto, but there's another detention center where we see this happening, is that geo staff, so ICE guards, use a type of cleaning agent to clean surfaces. But what happened during COVID was that they were using this chemical that specifically causes reproductive harm. It causes infertility, low sperm count and mobility, difficult giving birth, as well as low birth weight, long-term fetal deaths, and neurotube defects or NTDs. So GEO, the corporation that runs Adelanto and other ICE facilities, was using this chemical excessively and spraying it onto people in Adelanto. And there's actually a current case right now that opened in 2023 where there are, I believe, about 12 migrants who are suing GEO for causing that type of harm, medical and reproductive harm onto their bodies. So these are the types of reproductive and sexual violence that I particularly focus on my work in regards to ICE detention. Let me check the time real quick. Okay, so we already looked at that chart. So here's a quick picture, just a quick to show one of the photos and drawings of one of the women from the Irwin Detention Center that they drew of the hysterectomies they were subjected to. So finally, through my work, these are the main interventions that I aim to make. So the first one is looking at reform policies. So reform policies such as VAWA or Priya, and VAWA stands for the Violence Against Women Act, and Priya is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And in the current book project, I look at how these policies, in fact, have not put an end to sexual violence or reproductive violence in ICE detention. And I mean, specifically in regards to sexual assault and rape. In fact, what we see happening is that after the reenactment by Obama, that what happened, the result of that was that there was an increase of allegations and reports of sexual violence. So in my work, I argue that what VAWA and Priya, these feminist liberal reforms, what they really do is they allow the neoliberal state to absorb language of reformist language, right? They allow these liberal feminist discourses to be absorbed by the state. So one of the main things and concepts that I critique is the concept of consent, just like Dr. Kandaswamy was mentioning that incarceration itself is a form of it is a form of injustice and control of bodies. Therefore, what I argue is that consent cannot be given, right, for people in ICE detention or people in prison generally. And rather, instead of thinking about these reform policies of being productive and ending sexual violence, they absorb the language of consent to allow for the continuation of sexual violence. The other point, or abolitionist intervention in my work, is looking at how ICE detention itself relies on gendering and abuse of migrants as a form of border control and population management. And then lastly, I argued that we must look at the actions and protests and coalitions that are created by incarcerated survivors to see how they're creating an abolition geography, which that is, a different way of relating to space, time, and one another to counter a carceral geography. I believe I have a question. I will look back at that question later. I got a little distracted, sidetracked. So here in the last point that I want to make on why we must turn to people and survivors of sexual violence and previously detained people, one of the examples that I look at is a action called the Adelanto Toxic Tours. Toxic Tours was a two-day action where organizers in Adelanto took community members and city leaders to different sites in Adelanto, in the city of Adelanto, that is where this detention center is located. And they were able to talk about the different histories that intersect. So histories of militarism, histories of environmental degradation. And they also talked about the abuse of migrants inside the detention. They had survivors give their testimonies or testimonials. And finally, this action ended with the community here in this picture that you see here collecting soil samples because the community decided that they wanted to imagine collectively, come together and think about what could exist besides prisons, besides a detention center. And there were many different ideas given out. The community said they wanted a hospital, they wanted, a supermarket, because this desert town is also a food desert. But what was decided in the end was that they wanted to practice having a community garden. So one of the things that I write about is that these actions, the actions such as the Adelanto Toxic Tour, whether, we could actually build a garden or not is not really the question here. It's instead the coming together collectively, walking together and imagining what could exist there collectively, what can exist in that land, and what relation can we have to one another that provides a form of an abolitionist possibility. And then finally, I have this picture here. This is from some of the women in the Georgia ICE Detention Center who are holding the sign that says, "Tenemos derecho a la vida," we have a right to life. And I want to highlight that these women here are saying we have a right to life, not just we have rights, right? So not just rights, legal rights. They're pushing, the way I read this, they're pushing against that narrative of the legal definition of rights, instead claiming and affirming that they have a right to life. And I will end it there for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez, and such another really exciting presentation. I know that there was a question for you in the Q&A that I think you can answer there. It was I think a fact question. And meanwhile, we are going to move on to our third and final panelist, Dr. Connie Won, Executive Director and co-founder of AAPI Women Lead. Dr. Connie Won is not only the executive director and co-founder of AAPI Women Lead, but has also published in academic books, journals, and mainstream press, including the anthology Anti-Blackness, Critical Sociology, and Elle Magazine. She's a co-editor for the anthology Abolition for the People, The Movement for a Future Without Policing and Prisons, with Colin Kaepernick and Christopher Petrella. Dr. Won has appeared on Democracy Now!, MSNBC, NPR, and a huge range of podcasts. She's a former NSF fellow, a UC Berkeley Chancellor's Fellow, and so much more. She's also a former sex worker, high school and college educator, anti-sexual assault advocate, and organizer. In addition to all of those other things, believe it or not, Dr. Won continues to co-facilitate community-driven research projects on racial and gender violence, anti-Blackness, and carceral violence with organizations across the US. And I will chime in here just to say we were lucky enough at ARPC to be able to provide some early stage institutional and research support for AAPI Women Lead's partnered collaborative project that they recently completed, their intergenerational participant action research project on trauma and gender and sexual violence. And it is phenomenal. They're presenting on it on social media, at conferences. So keep an eye out for it. It's phenomenal, collaborative, grassroots research and knowledge production. And then on top of all that, Connie also has a daily meditation practice and is a yoga instructor who has trained in Muay Thai and kickboxing. So with no further ado, I introduce you to Dr. Connie Won.
Hi, everyone. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be with you. Thank you to American University's Anti-Racism Center, specifically Dr. Kaplan, Dr. Wong, and thank you, Neilani, for coordinating this brilliant event for us. And thank you to those in attendance for being a part of this conversation. I am extremely excited to be in conversation with you. I also want to definitely send a shout out to AU, Dr. Lilly, for being such important members of our AAPI Women Lead Intergenerational Participatory Action Research Project. Our lead senior research coordinator, Dr. Catherine, is also in the attendance with us today. So a shout out to all of us. So a couple of things. I want to definitely thank those of us who are here today. I'm thinking a bit about Priya's points on the exceptionalism and expansiveness of carceral logics. So thank you for that point. And I'm also thinking about punishment of people for self-defense. which helps me think through the possibilities of sex work as both labor and defense against the repression of heteropatriarchal forms of labor and sexuality. And then I'm thinking through Dr. Martinez's points and thinking about sex work in particular as also challenging notions of consent and sexual violence. So I thank you both for those comments and those points of intervention. Dr. Lilly, thank you also for giving us some areas of focus for today's topic, the convergence of prison abolition and reproductive justice. There are so many directions and ways we can approach the two overlapping vectors. The framework of these comments are grounded in Black feminism, feminist of color theory, critical prison studies, abolitionist praxis, and all towards the goal of freedom. The intersection of these politics help to better understand and identify the sources of violence, the rage and sorrow in our lives, and in particular, the need to abolish the entirety of empire, with its foundations in anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, including its history of carceral logics, carceral fantasies, its policies, and its practices. So I want to think through, there's so much to talk about, but for today, I want to think through some of my most recent observations. But before I begin, I want to recognize the 8 people who were killed 2 years ago in the Atlanta area. I want to also honor the hundreds of Vietnamese women and children who were killed on the same day in 1968 in the My Lai massacre by US soldiers. And I also want to honor the lives of all the people here and in Palestine, Haiti, Sudan, Congo, and more who have been victimized, are surviving, and continue to resist colonization and state violence by the hands of the United States. I honor all of their lives. On March 16th, 2021, a 21-year-old white man by the name of Robert Aaron Long, 2 of whom were white and 6 of whom were Asian migrant women. The Asian women who were killed were between the ages of 51 and 74. The site of these shootings were 3 massage spas. According to public records, Long explained that the motive behind the shootings and killings were in response to his, quote, sex addiction. Apparently, Long had recently been a patient of Hope Quest, an evangelical treatment facility that was down the street from the first spa he terrorized. And he was there for his addiction to porn and the massage spas. The night before the shooting, Long had also been evicted from his parents' home, purportedly because of this addiction. At the press conference the following day and after Long's arrest, Captain Jay Baker of unironically, the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department explained that Long refuted claims that his shootings were racially motivated. Instead, his problems were with his addiction, and that because these spas were a temptation for him, he, quote, wanted to eliminate them. Baker went on to explain that Long was, quote, pretty much fed up at the end of his rope, having a really bad day. And subsequently, this is what he did. In his explanation at the press conference, without any further critique, question, or concern, let alone empathy to the lives lost or the communities impacted, it was as if the police officer, also a white man, empathized with Long. Meanwhile, families of the deceased women and their surrounding communities were struggling with publicly sharing their names to both preserve their privacy as well as deflect or protect them from more surveillance and harm. Importantly, mainstream press in the area followed up on the shootings. In an article that I studied, the reporters highlighted the temptation of these spas, amplifying reviews that hinted to sexual services rendered at spas, are spas like the one Long terrorized and the provocative sexualized marketing of 2 of the spas that are part of his rampage. Quote, websites for both Gold Spa and aromatherapy feature women wearing tight-fitting clothing and striking seductive poses. The aromatherapy website has graphics added to make the women literally sparkle. One woman wears a lacy bra. The article goes on to cite national anti-sex work organizations that have partnerships with federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to validate their narrative. The article paints a picture of the massage salons as provocative and seedy sites for prostitution and human trafficking. The article cites Dawn Hawkins in particular, a white woman and executive director of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, who said, quote, Violent crime is far more likely when commercial sex is involved, including brothels fronted as spas and massage businesses, and women of color are disproportionately the targets and victims of that violence. In the article's depiction, the main perpetrators of violence were not Long, but the massage spas and the sex work industry. Generally speaking, Long and the people who were killed were victims of the commercial sex or the sex trade, a criminal industry, according to the article. Had the industry not existed, had the various systems, including the Georgia Board of Massage Therapy and the legal system, done a better job of regulating or policing these massage spas and the madams, their women would not have been killed because Long would not have been lured and tempted. Instead of emphasizing that violence against women of color, particularly sex workers or migrant workers, immigrants, undocumented people, was because of white supremacy, xenophobia, misogyny, sexism, homophobia, racism, anti-Blackness, or other forms or systems of violence that make up modernity and its empire, including religious fundamentalism and society's demonization and criminalization of sex work, or perhaps the over-policing and vilification of sexual desires, sex, and particular bodies, specifically when they are contrary to heteronormative fundamentalist values. The mainstream press instead blamed the industry and inadvertently the women who ran them or worked in them. This does not discount the possibilities or realities of exploitation, but I am highlighting that the discourse did not implicate the role that empire plays in placing people in vulnerable conditions, or that people are working in these industries as a means to subvert, navigate, or survive other exploitative conditions. Instead, the pervading logic is such that had it not been for the sex industries, these murders would not have taken place. In reading the article, one could come to understand that the salons and the lax legal systems were to blame for Long's bad day and his decision to take matters into his own hands. If the legal system was unable to get rid of these lewd, sinful places, Long would have to do it himself. He would eliminate his temptation by eliminating the spas, or more specifically, the spa workers and potential clients, a category he also fell into. The article argued for more undercover police to help eliminate the spas, despite evidence that police have a long history of committing their own acts of violence against women of color. According to the article, criminalizing sex workers drives rape and gender-based police violence by Juno Mack and Molly Smith. Quote, prostitution arrests are racist. They have always been racist. In 1866, San Francisco police arrested 137 women, virtually all Chinese. The police boasted that they had expelled 300 Chinese women. In the 1970s, the ACLU found that Black women were 7 times more likely to be arrested for prostitution-related offenses than white women. This disparity is no relic of the past. Between 2012 and 2015, 85% of people charged with loitering for the purpose of prostitution in New York were Black or Latinx. And between 2012 and 2016, the NYPD stepped up enforcement targeting massage parlors. As journalist Melissa Jira Grant details, during this period, the arrests of Asian people in New York charged either with unlicensed massage or prostitution went up by 2,700%. Importantly, and as a note, a lot of these arrests of these unlicensed massage parlors and workers are in gentrifying areas. Instead of recognizing this history, this article emphasized the failure of the legal system for not including or not indicting or punishing sex workers enough. The authors named a 51-year-old woman with an Asian-sounding name who had been charged but not necessarily punished or imprisoned in 2009 for pimping, prostitution, and giving massages in a lewd location. By highlighting this woman with an Asian-sounding first name, who was in the same age group as the women who were killed in 2021, this was to support their claims that the massage spa was in fact a part of the sex trade, and that she should have been punished for her criminal acts. Given the author's references, I'm curious if they would argue that Long's victims should have been arrested prior to March 16, 2021. Would the arrests have saved their lives? Or would the arrests have saved Long from his sexual addictions and his bad day? In this particular case, I remind us to consider the various ways that the carceral logics of policing are embodied by and practiced not only by police officers or prison guards, its obvious agents, or the criminal justice system, one of its primary state apparatuses, but it is enabled by and reflects a racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, anti-Black, transphobic, anti-Indigenous, whorephobic civilization. One that can only allow for particular bodies and sexualities to exist for reproduction or other forms of policed and regulated labor. That through carceral logics, white men, at least in the initial fantasies of white police officers, have the freedom to have bad days at the expense of anyone, particularly in this case, Asian migrant massage workers or sex workers. That is, in the eyes of the likes of Captain Baker, we are not only dispensable, we are positioned as the playground and the objects for white men's enactments, whether it be for their sexual fulfillments, to be framed as the enablers of their afflictions, or the cause of conflicts with their parents. Either way, according to the police officer in charge, these women who were mothers, who were actually mothers, caretakers, migrant workers who sent money home to their families here and in their homelands, instead of recognizing them as all of these complex roles, identities, forms of existences, they were instead relegated to be objects for white men's fantasies, to be projected onto and enacted upon. The carceral logic is that we, were meant to be his perennial objects. It is also here that I want to emphasize the logic of carceral feminism, which is VAWA, particularly by white women who systematically deputize themselves or advocate for and partner with law enforcement to police and discipline Black, Indigenous, Asian, and other people of color's bodies, particularly that of sex workers, while symbiotically positioning themselves as our saviors. In particular, and I end with this, this historical and ongoing demand to contain, criminalize, capture, surveil us is to preserve and police the boundaries and reproduction of her white supremacist heteronormative empire, all under the pretense that it is for our own good. These are the lessons that the carceral logic insists on teaching us, and those of which we continue to work against, to break free from. We break free, we demand an abolition to being their backdrop, their playground, their objects to be either incarcerated, played with, contained, saved, or disposed. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connie. If we could switch the spotlight back. Thank you so much. And I think at this point where I'm going to say a couple things, then I'm going to open it up to a gallery for all of our panelists. I'd love to open, I'm going to talk a little bit, ask you a couple questions, and then I'm going to open it to the group as a whole. So now is a great time. If you have questions, it's a great time to start putting them in the Q&A. I just wanted to make a couple of observations and ask a question. And I wanted to start really saying how well connected these different talks and presentations really were, and how really some of the great ideas and kind of connections that come across them. I was particularly struck by how, in the sort of early ways in which, Priya puts forth the problems of these kinds of, like, as we long know, these like deeply rooted in like white nationalist histories, in Enlightenment thinking, in particular kinds of Western binary logics of the innocent and the guilty, of the, irrationally criminalized versus the appropriately criminalized, that, Connie extended with thinking about the relationship between those who can be victims and those who are really always responsible or guilty for what happens to them and can never be actual victims deserving of empathy. What I'm really interested in is thinking about how these kinds of binaries that you all are posing and problematizing, how each of you in your own way responded by addressing, I think, one of the kind of key points of this panel, which is this point of convergence, or as some of you framed it, these points of collision, right? Because convergences are not always smooth and melding and like easy, right? They're also points of friction and collision. I was really struck by how, from Priya's early discussion of what happens when we look at where expansiveness can kind of respond to narratives of exceptionalism, right? How something can be, these can be two kinds of deeply related ways of thinking, how precisely the sites of liberal reform and social welfare are actually sites of creating hierarchies of value and meaning in people's lives and intimate structures. I was also really struck by the ways in which, Cynthia, you were thinking through that kind of convergence or collision of the border and the prison, of incarceration and containment and bordering, or as, you know, as Mary Pat Brady would call abjection, right? That abjection machine that is the border, and how they converge and collide in the ICE detention center. And Dr. Connie, I was particularly struck were the ways in which you were really thinking through this connection between labor and defense, and the kind of work of sex work as a site of labor and defense. And particularly, I think it brings up a convergence that to me undergirds this panel, but was maybe unspoken, which are the ways in which materialist feminists and reproductive feminists help us to think outside of the kind of carceral, anti-sex, anti-whore politics of carceral feminism, to really understand the ways in which sex work is part of that broad matrix of reproductive labor that we are talking about is necessarily part of that broader understanding, more expansive understanding of the concept of reproduction and reproductive justice that Priya referred us to in the beginning. So those are my overarching thoughts of just the really incredible ideas and things that you've put out there. And I wanted to kind of go from there to asking you to kind of dwell a little bit, not only on the convergences and collisions that each of you brought up, but also maybe some of the ones that your colleagues brought up. And I want to frame it with a sort of quote first, which is, so Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us that freedom is a place. And I'm wondering, when you imagine the various geographies of freedom, where prison abolition and reproductive justice converge, some of the geographies that we, you know, how these very kinds of convergences and collisions that we were just talking about operate, the various geographies where they're actually territorialized and converge, whether they're in Mount Tamalpais Community College, or whether they are in the ICE detention center, whether they are in the massage parlor, and the kind of representation of it as this site of, you know, guilty victimhood. I'm wondering, when we think about these kinds of these sites where prison abolition and reproductive justice converge to remake these complex places of carcerality and reproductive control, what do you envision those places of freedom to look like? We spent a lot of time talking about the places of unfreedom, right? Where these converge in these troubling ways. What do the places of freedom look like? Where are they located? How are they constructed? And what are the practices and relations to you? What are the ones that we really need to think about to sustain us and to sort of move us forward? And let's all just, can we make it a gallery, y'all? Thank you. You can take any part of that. It was a very long, like, excited ramble about how provocative I found your work. So really, this is the problem when you have a fangirl in your field moderating. So at this point, you're just going to have to take whatever part of that question you choose.
I could go ahead. I love Ruth Gilmore and been doing, you know, work on abolition geography lately. One of my favorite quotes, like following that conversation about freedom as a place, Ruth Gilmore talks about how different communities during slavery, different communities formed a geography of freedom without, quote unquote, having to move places at all. Right? So she's talking about creating a different relationality, even though the material conditions have not really changed. So when I think about those spaces of freedom, one of the most powerful things that I have seen is what occurred in the Irwin Detention Center, where there's the cases of, you know, the mass hysterectomies of women. During a panel hosted by Project South. One of the women, Pauline Binam, who is a Cameroonian woman, who was subjected to a sterilization, coerced sterilization. She's a victim survivor. And then later she was given a deportation order. She was part of the panel, and she talked about how in the ICE detention center, the different women who were victim survivors were able to connect to one another, having known who had been subjected to the same violence. And they were able to form a sisterhood. Her words, she said, we created a sisterhood amongst each other because we knew who had been sterilized. And they had this bond, this very intimate bond. And so for me, the way I think about that, it's like, that's a critical sisterhood formation. That's a coalition, collaboration, and a different way of relating to one another from something so horrific that happened to them in this carceral geography. And they're creating a network of support with one another in ways that they were never meant to create those networks of support, right? So when I think about abolition geography again, and the ways that Ruthie Gilmore reminds us that freedom is a place, and the way that it's created is sometimes, not changing the material conditions, but changing the way that people are imagining and healing and supporting one another and relating to one another. That's the example that I think about. She talked about how the women that formed these coalitions, those vivid example that I still have with me. That's it. I'll pass it to someone else.
Thank you, Cynthia. Who would like to take a stab at this, or whatever else you want to add next?
I mean, I really appreciated what you said, Cynthia. Like, I think that really resonates with me as well. I think particularly the idea of, right, like freedom is a place. So like, it's something we make through social relations. And so how do we remake places of unfreedom into places of freedom on a kind of daily basis, I think is a really like provocative and important question. I think this is also a really hard question. Because, well, for a lot of reasons, just because it is a hard question, and also because of the way that the word freedom is so tied to individualism in US vocabulary, right? And so like, I often really struggle to talk about freedom because I think that a lot of how freedom has been defined historically in the United States has been about individual rights or individual action, or the freedom is, right, like when the individual can do whatever they want. And that's like certainly not, that hasn't turned out well for people. And so like, I'm also really interested in thinking about like what forms of freedom emerge through interdependency, right? Like, and how do interdependent social relations produce different kinds of opportunities for freedom? And so like, I was trying to think about this question, and I think like thinking about like places of freedom are places where we are not individually responsible for ourselves and our well-being, but that we exist in a collective where we can rely on others in reciprocal ways to participate in making freedom together, to making creativity, to producing well-being for everyone, right? Like, so that like sense of, right, like, I mean, I think so much of neoliberalism is like, you're in it alone and you need to like do it all for yourself, right? So like, to me, right, thinking about places of freedom are places, right, where like individual autonomy is respected, but that individual autonomy derives through interdependency with others. And I mean, I think like some of the examples that you're giving there are really good examples of that. Like, I was also thinking about, when you were talking, I was thinking about like the welfare office and welfare rights organizing, and the ways in which when like welfare rights organizers in the 70s sat in welfare offices, they changed the place, right? Like, it was no longer like the place of, government bureaucratic control of their lives. It became theirs, right? And it was the place where the state gave them what they were entitled to, right? Like, so how like organizing works to change the meaning of a place. I think you see that in a lot of like organizing inside too, right? Is around, you know, the goal of prison is to isolate and confine, right? And so when people refuse isolation and insist that actually like, I am connected to you, right? Like that we are connected to each other and we are also connected to people on the outside, they're remaking place or refusing, right? The place of isolation in ways I think that point towards practices of freedom.
Thank you.
I think it is a hard question. So I think the two doctors ahead for forging the path. You know, what comes up for me is a couple of things. I would say I love Ruthie. And I'm also thinking through Saidiya Hartman's work, right? And I often cite her because I think her most recent work, all of her work, has just been mind-blowing and also quite settling because it gives you words, right? It gives you the words. So in her recent book, Wayward Lives, I think it's Wayward Lives, she talks about experimenting with freedom, right? Under conditions of captivity. And it was so resonant to me because she's talking, in particular, she cites sex workers, Black women who were playing and experimenting with freedom. So I think through our perpetual a coerced condition by which there is no real place for freedom, because this entire place for me, and I think for the people that I care about and think through or with, it holds us quite captive. And so I still think of freedom as atemporal. I still think of freedom as experimental. I still think of it as, most definitely, as Priya said, relational. And in that sense, I think about organizing spaces. I think about the people and relationships that I've been in, Priya and Sarah's in particular. When you asked that question, I thought, how lovely was it to see your faces again? Where, you know, we've known each other for decades, and we, you know, argued together, and we were in our teens, in our 20s, and we were, you know, 9/11 happened while we were sitting in these tables together. And decades later, we're still doing this work, trying to find our freedom and the freedoms of those we care about who are behind the walls, in different walls. And there was such a love, you know, and I really don't use that word lightly for many reasons, but it was there was something about our relationship and our struggle together, our care for one another, that I felt we were somewhat playing with freedom, right? Even in my relationship with Dr. Lily, who, you know, is our advisor on our project, like there's such a love and a care, and we consistently remind each other about the importance of relationships, right? Relating as a source of care, but also I think a site of freedom. So I think that those things, and then I think in terms of like global like warfare, and I think through all of the people who have marooned, I think of guerrilla warfare. I think of, in particular, I just came back from Vietnam last year, and the ways that guerrilla warfare was underground, fighting for freedom, where you couldn't find us, you couldn't find our people, right? So I think there's something about that as a place that can't be located, that is a constant place of struggle and care. And I don't know another really good adjective, but it's something like that, you know? So I feel like that helps me to think through freedom as a place. And it's also very explosive. That's what that kind of place is explosive to me.
I love this. I think that you all are really mapping out a vision of freedom that actually it really does come from that Hartman, that Hartman genealogy that goes all the way back to Scenes of Subjection, but, you know, runs all the way up through, I think you're right, Connie, you know, the more hopeful work, and also brings in, I mean, in many ways, it's interesting, this is Black Maternal Health Week. I don't know if you all knew that, which And I'm always so excited about Black maternal health week and always wanting us to be thinking about Black maternal health more broadly than just like reproductive bodies, like embodied reproduction. And I think that you all are pointing to the real implicit roots of this and also thinking Blackness in some really core ways. And I keep thinking as you're talking about freedom as a practice of relationality. You're talking about, and as a sort of a territorialization of relationality, but also as it being something that is ephemeral, that is not permanent, that is no less powerful for its ephemerality. But you're also, I think, talking about, something that is both contingent and also fugitive, right? And intentionally and powerfully fugitive. And I think that the ways in which this roots in the kinds of Black feminist genealogies that you've all gestured to is incredibly powerful. I also wanted to just shout out to the fact that we didn't talk about social reproduction a lot as a buzzword when we were framing this panel, but you've also really offered a model for social reproduction that takes the kinds of physical logics of mutual aid and moves it to a really profound level in the ways in which abolitionist thinkers have been doing over the last several years, but inserts it in thinking about how do we socially reproduce ourselves in the context of thinking about other modes of reproduction. So I think there's something really beautiful in watching you think this together. On that note, I'm going to ask you one last thing, one last thought. If there's something that you want people to take away that we haven't gotten to yet, or that we have gotten to yet, but you want to give another underline to, what would it be? One last take from each of you, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
I'll make mine quick, and I can't say it enough. I learned a lot from Priya and Sarah. I was probably one of the youngest ones in our table, in our organization. I was literally 18 or 19. And I say that because I think that's important in terms of the social reproduction and the political reproduction. And I thank you for remembering and reminding us of fugitivity, because I know in particular, those of us that are here, we're constantly in that position, right? Like, no, even if we're in these institutions, we're constantly trying to escape it, right? And so I want to just name my last remarks is that for me, abolitionist praxis remembers that empire onto itself is the biggest site of carcerality. It is carcerality. And then I want to honor the relationships, right? Black feminist thought, theory, practice, feminists of color, queer practice, theory, and relationships as potential guides out of this place of captivity, right? So I can't thank you all enough. Just seeing your faces and knowing your lineage too, Cynthia. I was like, for now we'll be okay.
Thank you, Dr. Connie. Who's going to go next?
I'll make it real quick. I might cut out. My internet's being choppy. If I had one last thing to say, I guess I would say something that I tell students and everyone I come across is that, yes, there is a world, a way alternative to carcerality, and it's very practical. And not only is it being created and imagined every day, but I really do believe, and we have to wholeheartedly believe that there's an otherwise world. So I always tell people, of course, we're going to have a world without borders. Of course, we're going to have a world without prisons. This isn't the way that we always have lived in relation to each other, and it won't be. And when, speaking of, in regards to reproductive justice and sexual violence, we have to always push forward that the idea and the notion that we know that we can't reform these spaces. We cannot form prisons. We cannot reform borders or these institutions. They would never be safe. They're always implicated in sexual violence. They rely on sexual and gendered violence. And it's going to take all of us, all of us, to really undo these structures.
Thank you. Priya, you get the last word.
I guess I want to build on actually what Connie and Cynthia said very beautifully, and I think come back also to Connie's earlier point about carceral feminisms, which is, I think, something that is sort of circulating in this conversation, right? And really, I think having a mindfulness of the ways in which logics of carcerality often end up informing various kinds of resistance, right? And so really trying to like think through, name, and turn away from forms of activism that reproduce carcerality, and I think Connie pointed to some really powerful ones. I think, in relation to reproductive justice, I think we can name a lot of like liberal pro-choice activism also has very carceral orientations to it. And I think that it's important for us, I think it's like a very difficult historical moment, right? And that and it has been a difficult historical moment for a long time, and there have been lots of different difficult historical moments. But I think that like in this moment, I see like there's just a lot of reactivity, right? And I think that it is important, sort of like coming back to what others have said, to like continue to have a vision of what we actually want, not just like reactiveness, right? And so like I think Cynthia sort of very beautifully articulated, right? Like there is a world beyond what we live in now, and like we should continue to move towards that, and that we need to evaluate political action and our thinking in relation to the world we want to live in, actually, not just in like a language of expediency or pragmatism, or I guess like very bluntly, I would say like we already know that the world we live in is like really, really bad. So it would be great to embrace experimentation, failure sometimes, the impossible, the things that seem like they couldn't possibly happen, with the knowledge that, actually the way things happen is by putting our energy towards them. So.
Great. Thank you all so much. And the very weird thing always about Zoom is there's no round of applause, but I'm going to applaud for you all and for each other. And let's open it to the Q&A. I don't see any new questions. Our panelists have been really diligently answering questions as we went along. But I want to see if there are any new open questions that people want to ask. I am not seeing any. There's one. Dr. Martinez, you had mentioned that your criticism of abolish ICE, the different transformations of the migrant rights justice movement, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little.
Oh, absolutely. What we have seen, not just through Abolish ICE, but I think oh my goodness, like abolish the police and the rhetoric, especially during the pandemic around policing, it has really entered a mainstream discourse, mainstream political formal discourse. And I think that is the dangers that we are facing nowadays with abolition. Not that abolition and this, this popularity of the theme of abolition is a bad thing, but the way that it's being absorbed again by the neoliberal state, which again absorbs all language of freedom and liberation, I would say, or it's attempting to. We see this happening with abolition, and I think it's something we have to be really careful with across different institutions, academically as well. Speaking as an academic, we have to be careful with the absorption of abolition. in academia and different movements and the political campaigns and so forth. My critique of Abolish ICE, particularly, if I could be very specific about it, is how it has been absorbed by nonprofits. Nonprofits that have, they have deliverables to oh my gosh, my English is to send, to give, to offer, and as well as the way that it's been talked about by politicians such as AOC, and at the time of the pandemic, Bernie, right, who were pro-abolish ICE. And if you ask them, what do you mean by abolish ICE? They would talk about just the institution of ICE, of immigration custom enforcement. And then they would say things, I think AOC said in some interview, she said, ICE didn't exist before 9/11, true. And she's like, well, we don't need ICE anymore. We could abolish ICE and go back to those days. But that's not what abolition is, as we know here, as folks who are, hopefully all the folks who are participating here, the audience. When we talk about abolition in regards to immigration, we really have to see the root of criminality and the formation of US immigrant law. They're one and one. They coincide. They were created alongside each other since the beginning, since the creation of the nation, I would say. So we can't just go back to pre 9/11, right? So anyways, that's one way that this discourse of abolition has really been reduced and misunderstood and decontextualized because, as we've been talking about here in this panel, abolition is a Black radical tradition. And we can't displace that or forget that. And it needs to continue to be recognized as such.
Love it. They said, thank you so much. I will say, since there's not another question yet, thank you so much, Cynthia. You said much better than I did the way that, nowadays, and everyone is like, but when they kept saying, don't be scared when they say defund the police, they don't really mean defund the police. No, it's no, that is actually what we did mean. Now I don't know what it means anymore, because apparently it means actually more money for the police, but that was actually never the point. So I think you're really pointing to the ways in which the kind of muting and mainstreaming of abolitionist ideas manages to turn them into reform. Okay, Laura Carter, do you have any thoughts on navigating institutions that are not necessarily abolitionist while maintaining abolitionist politics?
I worked in a prison, so I guess I could talk about that. I spent a little over a year working in a prison higher education program at San Quentin State Prison, which obviously the prison was not abolitionist, nor was the higher education program. And I think the way that I think about that or approach it is to really try to think about what are abolitionist potentials or possibilities in the context that you're in. So for example, I thought about it in terms of, well, how can you create space for greater student control of things, for example, right? So how can you facilitate, students using, right, the college to do organizing work that they want to do, right? Or how can you think about college programs, for example, as vehicles for building inside-outside relationships that can be transformative in both directions, right? So trying to think about what are the possibilities? I think that work is very difficult. And it gets squashed pretty quickly. So I think it's also important to find other folks who are in similar positions and to create networks or ways of doing that in collaboration with others. And then I also think it's important to think about those kinds of experiences also as learning experiences, right? So for me, it was also what can I learn about carceral institutions through this process, right? And even if, what can we learn about how these institutions work, how they absorb things, how they surveil things, like what they're doing, right? Which is, I think, something that can then translate into useful knowledge in other contexts as well.
Great. We've got a bunch of other questions, so I'm going to move on to another one. So Gabriella asks, thank you all for being here. All of your words and thoughts have been really wonderful. I was wondering if any of you have any thoughts about the role of children, youth, and schools within the discussions of criminalization, carcerality, freedom, and abolition that we've been having. Anyone want to take a stab at talking about the role of children and youth and schools in this?
I think I'll try that, namely because that was my focus when I was in academia. And I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, or anyways, I think what I would say is that we have to look at the intersections, but also the interstitial relationships between these different institutions, right? And I think that's important because when I was a school teacher, and I was a school teacher at a continuation school, and my students I had to often meet with their parole officers or their probation officers, right? The officers would come to the school and the kids would have, I'd have to report how the child was doing. And I remember not always telling the truth as an abolitionist. Because, things happen. I was a truant. So if my young person was not coming to school, I'd say some things like, oh yeah, they're so good. Oh man, so great, right? They're here all the time. So for me, the abolitionist praxis is every day in the mundane, in the unseen. But I understood that school sites, public schools primarily, because I studied them and went to school in them, are closely connected to policing and prisons, not only in the structure of the schooling onto itself, including, the policies and the practices of kids lining up and having to raise their hand and the surveillance systems and the like, but there was active punishment, particularly of young people, Black girls in particular, Black boys, other youth of color. And these policing and punishment practices often were not only to discipline the kids, but it was actively to punish them, right? And they would punish kids for chewing gum, for walking out to the bathroom, all of these things for plainly just being, right? And there used to be these things called zero tolerance policies, and now they've turned them into restorative justice. And that's the liberal approach to addressing bad kids, right? When again, the problem is the school. When again, the kids are rejecting the policies of why do I have to raise my hand to throw away the gum, right? So these young people are constantly resisting. And sometimes they are enacting their rage and their annoyances about being in a system that is policing them every step of the way, particularly if you're a young Black girl, particularly if you are gender fluid, particularly if you're a brown girl or any of the likes, right? So the young people are consistently enacting. Abolitionist praxis requires that we understand that and not try to reform the young people, but to understand what they are resisting. And then your role as an educator or whatever role you're going to play is also to keep them safe from not only the school, but from the policing and the prisons as well. That also reminds me, just to quickly say, that the relationship between these softer institutions, in scare quotes, and these more explicit carceral institutions, right? Higher education, like Priya mentioned, and prisons are closely connected. How many times have the police have shown up on campus, right? We're seeing that right now with the pro-Palestinian movements, right? So they're interconnected. And in that sense, I say it again, when we talk about abolition, we have to abolish the systems that are actually best friends, and they make these things each other possible, right? And I hope that answers your question, because schools, I've repeatedly said, are sites of carcerality. And so they don't get a pass, on the contrary.
Thank you. We are a little bit over time, and I'm going to actually just ask, I'm going to ask you to ask one more, I'm going to answer one more question, and I'm going to kind of batch two together in that magic way we do at the end of events. So one of our questions, Ariana asks about, first of all says, thank you everyone for this amazing space. How do we bring abolitionist praxis and theory to the forefront of education in prisons? And Priya, I think you've addressed a lot of that, but I think Ariana has one specific question, which is really, how do we do some of the things that Connie was just talking about in terms of both protecting incarcerated people? Ariana is working with teens in the prison system and would love to be able to bring these topics to them, but doesn't want to bring violence on them from the system that they're in and from the actors in these spaces, right? How do you do that kind of connection work without endangering the people you're working with inside, particularly youth? And Amina, another kind of practical but big picture question, as someone who's also trying to go into research but has not-for-profit experience, how do you navigate burnout, capacity management, and overwhelming experiences in these places? So last question, one go around, it's the big how-to question. What does this actually look like? How do we take care of ourselves? And how do we take care of the people we are working with?
I mean, I'll start with with Ariana's question. I think that I think it's a good question, right? And it's hard to answer without, I think you have to really understand the context that you're working in. And the best way to understand that context is to talk to the people who you're working with, right? Because a lot of times we assume you can't talk about certain things, but actually you could. And a lot of times things that we don't think about as dangerous to talk about are. So I think that actually talking to the people you work with is a good approach. I also think that one of the things that I learned very clearly is that a conversation about abolition with people who are incarcerated, it should be two directional, right? Actually incarcerated people can teach us a tremendous amount about abolition and how to practice abolition. And so I always, in my experience, I often felt like a lot of people wanted to come in and introduce people to new texts and things like that. Many people had already read those things inside and also had a lot of other things to say about abolitionist politics, and that, right, that there's a lot to be learned through dialogue around that. And that also I think abolition is a perspective and it's an approach, and that you can teach anything in an abolitionist way. So some of our most interesting conversations about abolition was talking about, right, the Moral Act and land grant universities and what is theft, right? So those are topics that don't necessarily look oh, I'm bringing in insurgent incendiary material, but actually we can have a really robust conversation about why are some things regarded as theft and other things are not regarded as theft. And that is a conversation that deepens abolitionist thinking on both ends really well. So those are just some thoughts on that question.
Dr. Connie, I'm going to make you talk about burnout. It's your specialty.
Oh man. The most profound thing I can say is oh man. I think I would suggest that you stop. I feel the smartest thing I'm gonna say to you, a couple of things is, one, you actually have to stop. This is a protracted war since its inception. And in that sense, I always think through when we are at war and you've been injured, number one, you want to not be injured. So when you're calling burnout or capacity management, I'd like for us to rethink that in the framework of war, and not as an analogy, but as a reality. Especially if this is the work that we're doing, trying to abolish things, that's not a game. It's not a joke, and it requires actual protection. And in that sense, I go back and say, when we are in warfare, you don't go in guns a-blazing and you're injured or you didn't sleep. I mean, maybe, but you have to make sure that you can participate and actually survive. Think of it as survival. This is not like a nonprofit game. You know, I may have started a nonprofit, but it's also because I'm marooned and became a fugitive of the academia. I was like, you guys are so racist, so sexist. Stop, I have to go, right? So I'll go back and just say, you have to think about it as survival in a protracted warfare. And if that's the sense, if you're injured, you got to go back to your base. And that is only possible. And I experienced this by going into a forced sabbatical last year. My team, our staff really helped me to do that. They came through as a community and they took over. Dr. Catherine that I mentioned, Jenny, our staff, all of the young people intergenerationally took over my work and let me just go nurse my wounds, which were severe. So it takes a perspective around how do you survive protracted warfare, because it's not charity work. And then you recognize your enemies are actually everywhere. That's not an analogy. And then you find who your bunker friends are, who are going to take care of both your wounds and you when you go nurse your wounds. Who's going to be the next line of defense? And I don't say that as an analogy. I say that experientially.
Thank you. Cynthia, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Oh my goodness, on both questions.
No, again, either one, both or either.
Okay. What I wanted to say in response to Ariana's questions about protecting others, that's always something that we have to negotiate. I was thinking in terms of academia. In academia, it's about negotiating that gaze, not negotiating, rejecting the academic gaze and knowing when to stop. Especially when, working with people who are incarcerated. I have to do this a lot in my work often. For example, I was looking for, the testimonies of sexual violence that have been lodged against ICE. And when I found these horrific accounts, I sat with myself and said, no, I'm not going to reproduce that specter of violence. So instead, in my work, I turned the gaze to the state and to the narrative rather than, the brutality. So I guess what I'm trying to say, Ariana, is reject that academic gaze and it's going to be so much worth it. But if we're talking about overall, not just in academia, one principle that I follow that I've learned from organizers and activists in the movement is the saying of, follow those who are directly impacted. So always be led and allow yourself to learn and be led by people who are impacted. Because, as much as I'm talking about things here, they're the theorizers. They're the ones creating these alternative worlds and alternative visions who have been directly impacted, who know that violence. We have another belief that those directly to the problem have the solution, or those who are closer to the problem have the solution. So that's how we protect others, with that principle. And in terms of protecting ourselves, I don't know. I think I'm really sitting with what Connie said, Dr. Woons, because I am very much that person who will go guns blazing and give it all until there's nothing left. And the reason I have learned to be that way is because I often look at myself and say, I'm not immune to this violence. My community is in warfare and people are literally dying. I mean, literally dying in detention centers, if not being forcibly sterilized, right? Or being deported to death. So I often think about, yes, this work is heavy as hell. I am often depressed, often sad about the world. But that's because our folks are dying and it is warfare. So how do we take care of each other? I don't know. There's other theories and beliefs of joy and finding joy in that resistance. And I do believe in that, but I still am practicing.
Cynthia's cut out a little bit, but I love this idea of practicing, right? Because I think we're all always practicing.
Wait, Sarah, can I just pause real quickly and insert a recognition of Dr. Lily? Your friend and your sister in struggle was so instrumental to my survival, not only of burnout, but in this period of warfare. And I don't use it as an analogy. She came through in ways that almost saved my life. And so I if not did, right? And I think that the community, per Priya's point, really matters. However big or small it is, you find your people, and they will often tell you when you're hurt, you got to go and we'll step in. We take turns. That's what the thing is. That's very important. We take turns and we find our people who really, truly are in this with you for all of us to survive, and not just them by themselves. The ones who are about surviving by themselves, those you can just put behind the enemy lines.
Right. And I think, you're all pointing to how we move away again from, if one of the problems of that model of, liberal freedom, right? Liberal freedom is the sort of individual notion of freedom is like the absence of restriction of rights. The problem is also that liberal freedom requires human sacrifice. It has always required human sacrifice. And when we imagine that the goal of freedom that we're working towards is that kind of freedom, then the idea that we can just sacrifice others or ourselves to get there can become very seductive. But that is not the version of freedom that I'm hearing any of us say, right? That is not liberation, right? Anything that is earned through human sacrifice is actually not liberation. So, at that note, I think this is a great place to end. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists. Thank you to all of our participants, and especially those who stuck it with us to the end, 10 minutes after end time. We will be sending the link to the recording to all of you. And as you know, ARPC believes that our job is not simply to inform or to enlighten, but it's also to empower. So be on the lookout for our accompanying resource guide with things that you can read, watch, listen to, or do if you want to continue this conversation in your everyday practice. Bye all. Thank you so much. Can you end?